When we think of politics, usually the first thing that springs to mind is Brexit, independence referendum, the EU, the UN, all that kind of stuff. Politics is something that happens in the cut and thrust of parliamentary debate. Like, sure, it affects our everyday lives, but it happens kind of at a distance. These are the terms on which we're used to talking about politics. Classical liberalism, which massively influenced our current political settlement, depends on a hard distinction between the public sphere and the private sphere. The public sphere is where politics happens. It's the sphere of economics, of work, of public debate, all that kind of stuff. But the private sphere is characterised by our intimate lives, the domestic and personal affairs that shouldn't be intruded on by the political realm. But as many feminists will tell you, and have been telling us for years, there is no such hard distinction. Our personal lives are deeply inflected by structures of power. The way we eat, the way we wash, the way we reproduce, who feeds us, who cares for us when we're sick, all of these things are fundamentally structured by dynamics of gender, of race, and of class. Cooking, cleaning, child rearing, all of these activities that are fundamental to reproducing human life are overwhelmingly performed by women. And most of that work is done for free. Make no mistake, the domestic labour with which women are saddled is indeed work. First of all, we shouldn't underestimate the sheer toil involved. Domestic and reproductive labour is hugely emotionally and physically taxing, even with technological advances like the washing machine and the dishwasher. But moreover, production in the formal economy depends on it as well. Pending full robot takeover, all production, all capitalism, needs workers. So you need a supply of healthy, living, competent people to keep the wheels of the economy nicely spinning along. So you need people to do the work of producing children, rearing them, sustaining themselves, feeding, cooking, cleaning, washing, making sure people are emotionally a little compos mentis. All that stuff is the lifeblood of the economy. There's this weird myth that's taken hold in Anglophone classrooms that women's work started in 1914 or 1939 when all the men were shipped off to war, and so women had to take their places. This is complete nonsense. For as long as there's been workshops, sweatshops, factory floors, schools, hospitals, women have been there working for a wage. But moreover, even when they're not recovering a wage for it, women have always been there performing this vital work of reproductive labour. There's nothing inherent to any of these activities that implies that a man couldn't do just as good a job, that these activities couldn't be shared. In fact, there's nothing to imply that they can't be performed for a wage. People are employed in legit jobs doing care work, domestic labour, sex work, emotional support work, even gestating fetuses. Yet the way we usually think about domestic and reproductive labour is so bound up with cultural norms about love that it implies that women should undertake this labour for free as an expression of an innate feminine tendency towards caring, as a labour of love. This discourse combines biological fatalism with heteronormative ideas of romance to privatise this vital domestic labour within the domestic sphere, behind closed doors. And actually, it implies that if you were to demand an equitable share of labour, or even to demand a wage for the work you perform, that would somehow be to cheapen this inherent tendency towards caring, even to deny your own womanhood. That isn't to say that caring for someone when they're sick or cooking them a meal can't be an expression of affection. Of course not. But when the language of human affection is mobilised to coerce women into doing far, far more than their fair share, it's not really about care anymore. It's about profit. It's no secret that the history of capitalism is characterised by a tendency among employers and legislators to drive down wages where they can, obliging people to work for few wages or for free. This is where the ideology surrounding domestic labour comes in so handy, because it privatises the most fundamental work of the economy. It takes the burden of social reproduction off the hands of employers who might be saddled with a pretty big wage packet if they had to pay for that work themselves. So instead of being recognised as a shared burden, as a necessary public good, it's cloistered away in the private sphere, ruled by transcendent forces of human biology and human affection. And when we're talking about people being coerced into doing domestic labour, it's important to remember that we're not just talking about the bored 50s housewife metaphorically chained to the kitchen sink. We're also talking about the chattel slave, literally in chains. Modern Western economies are founded on wealth accumulated by extracting labour from the bodies of slaves. To this end, female slaves were subjected to programmatic rape and forced breeding in order to ensure a steady supply of new labour. And to this day, the share of reproductive labour is deeply inflected by structures of race. Paid domestic work is overwhelmingly performed by women of colour, and particularly migrant women of colour. In a similar vein, we also hear the argument in favour of migration that we have an ageing population, so we need an influx of fertile migrant women to have lots of babies and boost the workforce. And I don't think anyone's suggesting that they be provided with free childcare for their trouble. So instead of being respected as humans, being granted dignity simply by virtue of being women who exist, they're forced to prove their worthiness by performing reproductive labour for free. And even in cases where women, particularly migrant women, are paid for their work, this work often takes place in exploitative conditions and is badly remunerated, thanks to low barriers to entry, poor regulation, and a generally dismissive attitude towards this work and the people who do it. We tend to heap it onto the bodies that we find most disposable. In fact, more people in the UK are trafficked into domestic service than are trafficked into the sex industry. And if you're working in these sectors, you're not likely to have much personal wealth of your own. So it's not like you can employ someone to do your cooking and cleaning, right? You're responsible for sustaining your own life. What this means is that even waged domestic work itself depends on unwaged domestic work. What's simply happening here is that the burden is being shifted from wealthier white women onto poorer women of colour. It trades white women's freedom for the further retrenchment of a pattern in which domestic service is performed by women of colour. There's been a lot of discussion recently around new work, and a lot of that discussion is negative. Freelancing, forced self-employment, self-unemployment, entrepreneurial poverty, all of these things are criticised, and rightly so. But interestingly, if you look at the character of these complaints, they look a lot like the conditions under which domestic labour has been performed for years. People talk about the fact that it's exhausting, it's all-consuming, it's isolating, it's hard to organise in workplaces because those workplaces don't really exist, that you never really get time off, and perhaps worse, that you're expected to love it. You're expected to profess your passion for whatever job it is, even if it kind of makes you want to crawl out of your own skin. Now, these things are pegged as injustices when applied to the world of formal work, but when applied to the world of domestic work, to the private sphere, usually designated as feminine or female, well, these things are just natural, right? They're just what it takes to be a caring mother, a caring sister, a loving friend. Poor working conditions are pathologised as the natural condition of femininity, particularly the femininity of women of colour. There's something rather galling about this, that a twisted interpretation of what it is to care, what it is to love, is mobilised to coerce women into doing work in all kinds of ways. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we should abandon all caring work, all domestic work, all reproductive labour. As Camille Barbagalo recently pointed out, such an effective strike might kind of be impossible precisely because of the social bonds that bind us to this work. A strike would involve leaving your kids unfed, leaving your elderly parents uncared for. But this might be a point of hope rather than a reason to despair, because it betrays the fact that society doesn't function according to the logic of competition. Society functions according to rules of mutual dependency. To care is to survive. And if the survival of society depends on work that women do, then it is within the gift of women to determine what kind of society survives. Packaged along with the burden of social reproduction is the possibility of social transformation.